Albert Einstein, Voltaire, Anne Lamott, Hildegard of Bingen, Arius the heretic, Vincent van Gogh, Nicky Giovanni, Baruch de Spinoza, Frida Kahlo, Thich Nhat Hanh, Copernicus, Langston Hughes, Margaret Fuller, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Gloria Steinem, Sophia Lyon-Fawz, and so many more. The list of people, teachers who have no idea how their words have had an impact, have inspired and motivated me, that list goes on and on. One day, a little blue, I sat down and counted my riches. These were the people who showed up on my list, people who have had an influence that don't know me, who have no idea who I am. Quickly, think of at least 5 people, famous or not, on your list. I don't know how anyone could not feel rich with a list like this. By the way, did you know that St. Nicholas, yes, Santa Claus, was a man who was born in the 3rd century in present-day Turkey? He grew up to be a bishop and endeavored to serve the poor, including by distributing gifts. I don't know, he came on my list too. Crazy. Did you know that when Constantine said, enough of the fighting, I'm going to call the bishops together and we're going to vote to determine whether Jesus was fully human or whether he was substance of God equal to God? At the Nicene Council, when the Nicene Creed was voted on, 325 AD, St. Nicholas was there. Is that wild? Now, just a quick nod to history here. The reason the Christian creed emerged was because of an ongoing argument. There was a bishop, Arius, who promoted the idea that Christ was created finite in nature, human, like us, and not equally divine like God. Constantine's request to take a vote in order to cease the conflict, Arius lost. Arius is of our heritage. The Nicene Creed that defined Jesus as God incarnate and not a man was birthed, and Arius was exiled from the community. The other teacher who has been on my mind this week is Jesus, son of a carpenter, Joseph and Mary of Nazareth. Yes, his name is the Latin form of the Greek form of the Hebrew word for Yahshua or Joshua in modern day English. It is written that the servant of both God and humanity taught a radical form of love that was totally unconventional and against the mainstream cultural norms of the time. Word has it, he was amazing. I have to admit, yes, I'm a Jesus junkie. I'm not ready to give up on his teachings. There are other Unitarian Universalists who are groupies too, but this impulse to say so in front of others, it's not popular in our ranks. Doug Mutter captures this sentiment quite well. He wrote, say much of anything positive or negative about Jesus of the Bible, and many UUs will look at you like you just let out a loud belch. I thought that's, in my time, 16 years of ministry, I think is right. We're very uncomfortable at times. Here are a few more words that Doug wrote. Now, Doug is a contributing editor and columnist for UU World magazine. He also had articles appear in other publications, such as Religious Humanism, The Humanist, and Public Eye. He says, one reason why I identify with Unitarian Universalism is because our religion struggles with its past. Unitarianism and Universalism each started out Protestant, pushed Christianity's boundaries until they broke, and then, finding each other along the way, 1961, the Unitarians and the Universalists merged. We have since gone on a spiritual journey through humanism, paganism, and a few more isms that probably don't even have names yet. Well, me too, Protestant, pagan, Buddhist, humanist, you name it, the whole long, strange trip. That's my story, and I know many of you share that. If today I have trouble summing up my deepest convictions in a nice, clean soundbite, like an elevator speech, as former UUA President William Sinkford calls it, that puts me right in the mainstream of UU tradition. This is what Doug Mutter writes. It has been the fault of all factions and sects, wrote the 19th century Unitarian William Ellery Channing. He is considered one of our forefathers of our tradition, that they have been too anxious. People are too anxious to define your religion. They have labored to circumscribe the infinite. That is, to confine a description of the infinite. He says, my elevator speech is and always has been a muddle. Occasionally, I imagine that I've gotten it right, only to have it turn to ashes in my mouth the next time I try to use it. Inevitably, I've left out something essential or said something essential or said more than I really believe, or both. My religion may or may not be infinite, but it certainly defies all my attempts at circumscription. Maybe you understand this. I've said this to people before. When outsiders ask me, what do Unitarian Universalists believe? I know in my heart of heart, when I came here, exactly who I was and that this is who I've always been. But it's hard. It's like, unlike my elevator speech, writes Doug, my identity as a Unitarian Universalist is not a muddle. On the contrary, it gets more and more solid all the time. But the harder I try to confine it or restrict it to a definition, the more camaraderie I feel with the efforts of my fellow UUs. The content of their struggles may differ from mine, but I take an ever-increasing pride in our stubborn unwillingness to grab for the easy answer or stifle the inconvenient question. Reading the words from Unitarian Universalists of the past helps this writer, Doug Mutter, to explore his questions. He said, as I read Channing's 1819 sermon, Unitarian Christianity, I imagined a hush falling over the Baltimore church when he announced that the traditional doctrine of the atonement, that is, that Jesus died for your sins, he disagreed with that. And he said that they were used to this description of the anger of God, that it communicates very degrading views of God's character. And Doug said, I wondered what expressions Theodore Parker, another forefather, saw in his listeners' faces during the 1841 sermon, The Transient and Permanent in Christianity, when he proclaimed that the doctrine of Christianity would be equally true even if it could be shown that Jesus of Nazareth had never lived. But how they struggled, I think still has a lot to teach. If you look in our Unitarian Universalist history, there's been struggles. Parker did not take the Christianity of the day as a given and argue for or against it. Each found elements of unspeakable wonder in Christianity, encrusted by doctrines and theologies gone horribly wrong. Channing looked for the essential in Christianity, Parker of the permanent. Reading them, Doug said, I picture Christianity like a statue that has been dredged up from an ancient shipwreck, with only a gleam here and there betraying the promise of what lies beneath. The UU founders did not seek to pass on unchanged the religion of their teachers, but to remove the incrustations without shattering the statue to fragments. Isn't that a beautiful image? Imagery of a Christianity still gleaming, something of value, but having incrustations, maybe barnacles all around it, that takes some time to peel off, to remove the incrustations without shattering the statue to fragments. Christianity in its purest form derived from the legacy of a kind, caring rabbi, a Jewish storyteller and healer, is beautiful. Now, some folks still look at Christianity and see a form of the belief that has been tarnished by harmful and misguided purposes, seeing no redeeming qualities and throwing Jesus and the whole tradition overboard. And I have to tell you, you see it on the news, as do I. It's really tough to think that there is good in Christianity when right now the political system is taking a beautiful religion and totally deconstructing it, not in a good way. Let me tell you a story about some banned documents that give us a little indication of what a cherished tradition might have been. By the time of the Emperor Constantine's conversion, when Christianity became an officially approved religion in the 4th century, Christian bishops, previously victimized by police, now commanded them. Possession of books denounced as heretical, does this sound familiar? Was made a criminal offense. Copies of such books were burned and destroyed, but in Upper Egypt, someone possibly in a monastery at St. Pacumus took the banned books and hid them from destruction in a jar. And if I say jar, maybe some of you who know history and have researched know what I'm talking about. It was a jar that remained buried for almost 1,600 years, the Nag Hammadi codices, or papyrus manuscripts discovered near the city of Nag Hammadi in southern Egypt. The text with ascetic overtones, ascetic, meaning Eastern, meditational practices, Eastern understanding. The texts, including instructions on how to nurture one's own personal journey to acquire enlightenment, were smuggled and buried as Christian orthodoxy grew. That is, when Christianity was deemed the law of the land. This was the time when only priests, bishops, and deacons were entitled from having been trained by the ancestry of Peter, the man who had been identified. Peter took over when Jesus was said to have returned from the grave. Only Peter could speak as authority on behalf of the late Jesus, and the sole receiver of the knowledge of God could reign supreme as voice and authority to reign politically and religiously over all others in the land. And I'm speaking also about the hidden text called the Gnostic Gospels. Elaine Pagels wrote a beautiful book. It's quite old now, but I still cherish this because for as those who claim, she said, to know nothing about ultimate reality are called agnostic, meaning no knowing. The person who does claim to know such things is called Gnostic. Gnostic. But gnosis is not primarily rational knowledge. The Greek language distinguishes between scientific or reflective knowledge. A person knows mathematics, and knowing through observation or experience, he knows me, which is gnosis, this knowing, this inner knowing. As the Gnostic term, use of the term, we could translate it as like an insight, perhaps. Maybe some of you have experienced moments that felt holy, that you knew maybe was sacred. You knew it, but you find it difficult to describe. That's a form of Gnosticism. And to know oneself, they claimed, is to know human nature and human destiny. According to the Gnostic teacher Theodotus, writing in Asia Minor, this is pre-existence of, 140 to 160 before AD. The Gnostic is the one who has come to understand who we were and what we have become, where we were, whether we are hastening from what we are being released, what birth is and what is rebirth. That's theology. It was present before the birth of Christ and in the Gnostic Gospels. The living Jesus of these Gnostic texts speak of illusion and enlightenment. How often have you heard in Christian churches enlightenment? And it's not texts about sin and repentance like the Jesus of the New Testament. Instead of coming to save us from sin, he comes as a guide who opens access to spiritual understanding. But when the disciple attains enlightenment, Jesus no longer serves as just the spiritual master. The two have become equal and even identical. That's where I become the Jesus groupie. He too was a man trying to make sense of the world and what to do that is helpful in the world and what is not helpful. Maybe the understanding is where we came from and where we go when we die. Orthodox Christians believe that Jesus is Lord and Son of God in a unique way. He remains forever distinct from the rest of humanity, whom he came to save. The Gnostic Gospel of Thomas recognizes him, Jesus, and says to Thomas that they have both received their being from the same source. Jesus said, I'm not your master in this text. The discoveries at Nag Hammadi have upset this picture, the one where politics and religion are intertwined. Think of the times. The rule at the time required that peasants are to bow to the bishops who rule the land as instructed by God. By 200 AD, Christianity had become an institution headed by a three-rank hierarchy of bishops, priests, and deacons who understood themselves to be the guardians of the only quote-unquote true faith. The majority of churches, among which the Church of Rome took a leading role, rejected all other viewpoints of heresy. Do you know what heresy means? To choose, the ability to choose. Sound familiar? These banned books, these banned texts written on papyrus, when they were unearthed literally by a farmer seeking good dirt in his field in Egypt in 1945, it wasn't until 1980 that they were finally photographed, translated, and made available to researchers. The first, says Elaine Pagels, the first to investigate those Gnostics and their texts were the Orthodox contemporaries, attempting to prove that Gnosticism was essentially non-Christian. They traced its origin to Greek philosophy, astrology, mystery religions, magic, and even Indian sources or Hindu sources. So through the years, the scholars have come to agree that what we call Gnosticism was a widespread movement that derived its sources from various traditions. One academic, Professor R.M. Grant, has suggested that Gnosticism emerged as a reaction to the shattering of traditional religious views, Jewish and Christian, after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. The British scholar E.R. Dodds characterized Gnosticism as a movement whose writings derived from mystical experience. So the biblical text people cling to today, and the many various translations like the King James Version and more, actually represents only a small selection of specific sources. Gnostic Christians held views that the Orthodox Christians abhorred. For example, an ancient text that was found before the text of Nag Hammadi and left out of the current collection of biblical texts today, what we now call First and Second texts, but you all know as New and Old Testament. There was a chapter, a book that existed, but it was purposely left out of the text. It was called the Gospel of Mary. Although we find references to Mary Magdalene in the typical biblical text, the Gospel of Mary was not included. So here is what today's Easter message is where today's message surfaces. Mary was said to have been the first to have seen the risen Christ and appears to the other disciples only later in the evening of the same day. According to the Gospel of Mary, seeing the Lord in a vision, she said, "How does he who sees the vision see it? Through the soul," she said, "or through the Spirit?" He answered that the visionary perceives through the mind. That was Jesus' answer to her in this form of a vision. But in this form of the gospel, when Mary tells the other disciples that he visited her and what he said, "Do not weep and do not doubt, for his grace will be with you completely." Peter immediately dismissed what she said. In a Nag Hammadi text titled Letter to Philip, it states that Jesus appeared to the disciples as a great light and a voice saying, "I am Jesus Christ, who is with you forever." These are very comforting words. The thing is, even that too was too transcendental. Orthodox Christianity pointed out that Jesus appeared to the disciples, Peter first, in a physical body, which is different than what Mary said. But it addresses humanity's biggest fear. Imagine living in a time of disease and serious illness and death. You would want to know, oh, so I may fall asleep, but I will come back in body. That was Peter's point. To overcome death, a human longing to overcome death. To appear to Peter in human form is to imply that you too, as a believer, will come back to life. In terms of the social order, the Gnostic teachings were too subversive, claiming that everyone would have access to God, which circumvented the authority of the papacy, bishops, and priests. a final point here, is that we can only surmise much of what went down more than 2,000 years ago regarding the death of a man, the Jew from Nazareth. And yet, what do we know as historical fact is that certain disciples, notably Peter, claimed that the resurrection had happened in front of him. More importantly, we know the result. Shortly after Jesus' death, Peter took charge of the group as its leader and spokesman. According to John, he received his authority from the only source the group recognized, from Jesus himself, now speaking in human form, but not a vision, from beyond the grave. When one dives into the research of the loves and the lives of heretics of the past, a reminder, one who chooses, I hope you will celebrate with me today that our Unitarian Universalist heritage emerges from a long line of thinkers and believers who never accepted society's demands, threats, and ploys to adopt beliefs at face value. This continual seeking to understand is one of our best, most greatest gifts. We are a living tradition, meaning we continue to grow, we continue to change, we continue to seek understanding. We have much to learn from a, we don't know, 32-year-old, might have been a 36-year-old man, Jewish man, who at the time resisted the Roman rule of law to bow down and worship the emperor, who was countercultural in his view of women, who raised his voice on behalf of justice and compassionate treatment of the sick and the poor. May this Easter morning remind you that no matter what has gone before, today is a new day, resplendent with new opportunities to pursue a better life, rich with insight, meaning, and fortitude. May we all move forward into the world to make a more just, equitable, and make present love in the world. May it be so, and amen.